I thought stopping by my father's house unannounced in Buckhead would be a simple surprise. Instead, he yanked me through the front door, his eyes wide with panic, and shoved me straight into his cedar coat closet. "Hide," he hissed, turning the lock just as the doorbell echoed through the foyer. I held my breath in the dark, confused and terrified. Then I heard my husband's voice in the hallway, followed by my sister's laughter. What they discussed next in that office shattered my entire reality and ignited a war they could never win. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your trust broken by the people who were supposed to protect you. The overwhelming scent of cedar and stale cigar smoke suffocated me in the pitch-black space. I pressed my back against the heavy winter coats, trying to understand why my father Vernon, a retired Atlanta city councilman who cared about nothing more than his pristine public dignity, was acting like a frightened criminal. My knees scraped against a pair of expensive golf shoes as I crouched lower into the shadows. The heavy oak door of his home office clicked shut, trapping me inside the closet built directly into the room's custom cabinetry. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to regulate my breathing. Why was I hiding in my own father's house? I had only come over to drop off a gift, a rare bottle of scotch he had mentioned wanting months ago. Now I was shivering in a dark box, feeling like a trespassing stranger in the home where I grew up. Through the thin wooden slats of the closet door, I had a restricted but clear view of my father's mahogany desk and the luxurious leather armchairs arranged in front of it. I heard the distinct sound of ice clinking into heavy crystal glasses. Then a voice that made my blood run instantly cold echoed through the spacious room. "Pour me a double, Vernon," my brother-in-law Preston demanded. His arrogant, grating tone was unmistakable. Preston was a wealthy white commercial real estate developer who had married my sister Sierra 5 years ago. He always spoke to my father as if Vernon were his hired employee rather than his father-in-law. He carried his privilege like a weapon, wielding it whenever he entered a room, constantly relying on subtle microaggressions to belittle the rest of us. I heard the heavy thud of someone dropping onto the leather sofa. A familiar, high-pitched laugh fluttered through the air. It was Sierra, my older sister, the former pageant queen and the undisputed golden child of our family. She had always been the beautiful one, the perfect daughter, who could do no wrong in our father's eyes, while I was the stubborn disappointment. "Are we really doing this today?" Sierra asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I have a major brand sponsorship dinner tonight and I cannot look stressed. You know how important my influencer metrics are right now." "You will not have to stress about anything ever again, baby," another voice replied. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought the sheer force of it might crack my chest wide open. That was Darius, my husband of 7 years. The man I had kissed goodbye just 3 hours ago when he told me he was rushing to his investment banking firm to handle an emergency client meeting. He had kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and promised to bring home dinner from my favorite restaurant. I shifted slightly, pressing my face closer to the wooden slats, my breath hitching in my throat. What I saw next paralyzed me completely, rooting me to the floor of the closet. Darius, my charismatic, supposedly devoted husband, walked right past my father and pulled my sister Sierra to her feet. He wrapped his arms tightly around her waist and kissed her deeply, passionately, right there in the middle of my father's office. I waited for my father to shout. I waited for Preston to throw a punch. I waited for the world to explode into chaos. Nothing happened. Preston simply took a sip of his bourbon and checked his luxury watch, seemingly bored by his wife kissing another man. Vernon, my own flesh and blood, merely adjusted his reading glasses and sat behind his desk, completely unfazed by the sickening display playing out in front of him. "You two can celebrate later," Preston said, waving his glass dismissively. "Let us handle the business first, Darius. Did the wire go through?" Darius released my sister, leaving a visible smudge of her expensive pink lip gloss on his mouth. He smirked, pulling a folded document from his tailored suit jacket and tossing it onto my father's desk. "The transfer cleared an hour ago. $500,000 moved straight from my joint savings account with Jada into your holding company, Preston. It is completely clean and untraceable." My hands began to shake uncontrollably. $500,000. That was the expansion fund for Lux Haven, the interior architecture and luxury staging firm I had built entirely from the ground up. I had worked exhausting 80-hour weeks dealing with difficult clients, managing toxic contractors, and sacrificing my own well-being to save that money. It was meant to secure a massive national contract that would put my business on the map. And my husband had just casually handed it over to my brother-in-law like it was pocket change. Excellent, Preston nodded, sitting down heavily across from Vernon. That covers the immediate shortfall on my Midtown project. Now we just need to finalize the primary objective. Vernon, do you have the doctor on standby? My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the expansive desk. He is ready. Dr. Evans has agreed to sign the evaluation for a fee, of course. He will state that Jada is suffering from severe clinical exhaustion and paranoid delusions brought on by extreme work stress. All he needs is the family to unanimously request an involuntary psychiatric hold. I clapped both hands over my mouth to stifle the gasp clawing desperately at my throat. My vision blurred with hot, angry tears. They were not just stealing my hard-earned money. They were plotting to lock me in a psychiatric facility to silence me completely. Darius laughed, a cruel, mocking sound I had never heard from him before. It is almost too easy. Once she is committed, I will file the emergency power of attorney. As her husband, I take full legal control of Lux Haven. We sell off the commercial real estate she bought last year, liquidate the entire staging inventory, and I walk away with full executive control. Sierra traced a manicured finger along Darius's jawline, her eyes gleaming with malice. And then you and I can finally take that month-long trip to Monaco we have been talking about. Jada has been dragging you down for years anyway. She is so obsessed with her little business she hardly even notices what goes on around her. She deserves to lose it all. Preston chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. You know, it really should not be hard to convince a judge. She is an emotional black woman who thinks arranging couches and picking out curtains constitutes a corporate empire. She got lucky in a booming market, but real estate requires a man's touch. Once she starts crying in court, the judge will hand over the keys without a second thought. It is the perfect plan. The sheer audacity of his racism and sexism delivered with such casual comfort in my father's own home made me violently nauseous. But what broke my spirit entirely was my father's response. Vernon sighed, shaking his head, as if I were a tragic burden he had borne for decades. Jada always was unstable. You all know how difficult she has been since childhood. Remember when she threw away her entire college tuition fund to start that ridiculous staging company? I told her to go to medical school like a respectable woman. I told her she lacked the discipline. Locking her in a facility for a few months is the only way to protect the family assets from her erratic behavior. Plus, Darius, you promised this would settle my outstanding debts. My own father. The man who had stood at my mother's grave and promised to protect me. He was selling my freedom and my life's work to cover his hidden gambling debts. I thought back to that day 14 years ago. I had begged him to support my dream of building Lux Haven. He had called me a foolish, stubborn girl who would never measure up to Sierra's beauty or grace. I had scrubbed floors, waitressed double shifts, and lived on cheap noodles to fund my first staging project. I had built a multi-million-dollar company, while Sierra played dress-up on social media and married a racist developer for his money. And now they were sitting in a room casually dismantling my entire existence. But the scared little girl seeking her father's approval died in that closet. As the initial shock wore off, a cold, sharp clarity washed over me, replacing my terror with absolute focus. I slowly lowered my hands from my mouth. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen cast a faint glow in the dark space. I opened my voice recording app and pressed the red button. Let them talk, I thought. Let them dig their own graves with every single word. I need the power of attorney papers, signed by tomorrow morning. Darius instructed, pulling another document from his briefcase. Vernon, I need your signature here as the primary family witness confirming her erratic behavior. Sierra, you will sign as the secondary witness. Sierra eagerly grabbed a pen from the desk. I will be happy to sign. Honestly, she did this to herself. If she had just listened to you, Dad, and stopped trying to act like some big-shot CEO, she would not be in this mess. I always end up with the best things anyway. It is just the natural order. I recorded it all. I recorded Preston bragging about how he would dismantle my company's assets to save his failing commercial projects. I recorded Darius complaining about how he had to pretend to love me while planning his exit strategy with my sister. I recorded my father agreeing to perjure himself for a payout. Every second of audio was a nail in their coffins. I watched the recording timer tick past 4 minutes. I had enough evidence to put all 3 men in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud. I just needed to stay perfectly still until they left the house. Then I would walk straight to my corporate lawyer's office. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. I had been so focused on recording their treachery that I had completely forgotten about my daily schedule. Every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, I had an alarm set on my phone to remind me to check the inventory logs for my warehouse. The timer hit 4 minutes and 10 seconds. Suddenly, a loud, cheerful marimba melody erupted from my phone. The alarm tone bounced off the wooden walls of the closet, amplifying the sound in the enclosed space. I scrambled frantically to mute it, my fingers slipping on the screen in my panic. It took 2 agonizing seconds to silence the device, but the damage was already done. The conversation in the office stopped dead. Silence, heavy and suffocating, descended on the room. "What the hell was that?" Preston demanded, his voice sharp and alert. "It came from the closet," Darius said. I heard the heavy footsteps of expensive leather shoes moving across the hardwood floor. They were coming closer. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was nowhere to run. The closet was too small to hide behind the coats, and the door was the only way out. "Vernon, wait," Preston commanded. "Who is in there?" My father did not answer. He knew exactly who was in there. He had locked me in just minutes ago. I clutched my phone tightly to my chest. The recording was still running. If I was going down, I was taking their confessions with me. The brass handle of the closet door rattled. Then the door was violently yanked open, flooding the small space with harsh overhead light. I blinked, squinting against the sudden brightness. As my eyes adjusted, I looked up to see 4 pairs of eyes staring down at me. Preston stood closest, his hand still on the door handle, his face a mask of shock and growing fury. Darius stood right behind him, the color draining from his face as he realized his wife had just witnessed him kissing her sister. Sierra covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with terror. And my father, Vernon, stood behind his desk, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. No one moved. No one breathed. The air in the room was thick with the undeniable reality of what had just happened. They had been caught. "Well," I said, my voice dangerously calm as I stepped out of the closet and smoothed the wrinkles from my blazer. "I suppose this means the family dinner on Sunday is cancelled. Let us see how you manage to explain the situation to the authorities when I show them exactly what I have been recording for the last 10 minutes. I raised my phone, making sure the red recording light was clearly visible to all of them. The expression of absolute panic that washed over my husband's face was the most satisfying thing I had seen in years. This was only the beginning of their downfall. The silence in the room hung heavy and suffocating. No one dared to breathe as my words settled over them. I watched the initial panic on my husband's face slowly morph into something else entirely. The handsome, charming mask that Darius wore for the world melted away, leaving behind a cold, calculating stranger. He did not look like a man who had just been caught cheating. He looked like a cornered animal ready to attack. Before I could even register his movement, he lunged forward. His large hands gripped my wrists with a bruising force that sent a shockwave of pain up my arms. He snatched the phone from my grasp so violently that my fingernails scraped against the metal casing. "You always were too nosy for your own good, Jada!" He spit the words, hitting my face like venom. He threw the device onto the solid marble floor with terrifying, brutal strength. The sickening crunch of shattering glass echoed through the expansive office. But that was not enough for him. He raised his expensive leather dress shoe and brought his heel down on the shattered screen, grinding it into the marble until the metal casing bent and the internal components spilled out like broken teeth. He stood chest-heaving, looking down at the destroyed device with a triumphant smirk. He honestly believed he had just erased his entire problem. He thought my silence was fear. He thought my stillness was submission. He had no idea that my silence was simply the calm before a hurricane. I looked at the shattered pieces of my phone scattered across the imported rugs my father loved so much. A normal wife might have fallen to her knees weeping over the betrayal. She might have screamed at her sister or slapped her husband across the face. But the sheer magnitude of their treachery had bypassed my emotions completely and activated a clinical survival instinct deep within my brain. I slowly raised my eyes from the broken glass and looked directly at my father. Vernon was the patriarch, the man who was supposed to protect me from monsters like Darius and Preston. Instead, he simply adjusted his tailored suit jacket and walked around the massive oak desk. His face held no remorse, no guilt, and no paternal love. He looked at me not as his flesh and blood, but as a business problem that needed to be liquidated. My father reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. He dropped the stack onto the polished wood surface. The heavy thud sounded like a judge dropping a gavel. He slid the papers across the desk until they stopped right in front of me. I glanced down at the bold black lettering at the top of the page. It was an irrevocable power of attorney, accompanied by a complete business handover contract. The documents were fully drafted, requiring only my signature to surrender my entire life to them. "Sign it, Jada," my father demanded, his voice icy and devoid of any warmth. "Darius will assume full executive management of Lux Haven, effectively, immediately. The company needs stable leadership, and you are clearly not in a position to provide it." I stared at the man who shared my DNA, trying to find any trace of the father who used to hold my hand when I was a little girl. There was nothing there. I asked him what he meant by stable leadership. My tone was dangerously quiet, betraying none of the absolute rage boiling in my veins. Vernon leaned forward, pressing his knuckles onto the desk. "If you choose to fight us, Jada, I will personally testify to a judge that you came here today in a state of severe psychiatric distress. I will tell the court under oath that you have been threatening self-harm and exhibiting dangerous paranoid behavior due to the stress of running a business you are not equipped to handle. Sierra and Darius will back up my claims. We already have a respected medical professional ready to sign the involuntary commitment papers. If you refuse to sign this handover contract, you will lose your business anyway, but you will also be locked in a psychiatric ward by morning. Your reputation in Atlanta will be destroyed. No luxury client will ever hire you again once the narrative of your mental breakdown hits the society blogs." The threat was so meticulously cruel that it stole the breath from my lungs. They had planned every single detail. They knew that as a successful Black woman in the elite circles of Buckhead, my reputation was my most valuable asset. They were weaponizing the very real societal stigmas against Black women seeking mental health support. They were going to paint me as the angry, unstable Black woman who cracked under pressure. It was a flawless execution of systemic and familial abuse wrapped in legal jargon. Sierra stepped out from behind Darius, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "Do not look so dramatic, Jada," she sneered. "You brought this on yourself by constantly trying to act bigger than you are. You should have stayed in your lane instead of trying to play corporate boss. Just sign the papers and go home quietly. Maybe then Darius will not leave you entirely destitute." Before I could even process my sister's breathtaking entitlement, Preston moved into my personal space. The scent of his expensive bourbon and overpowering cologne washed over me, making my stomach churn. He looked down at me with the specific brand of arrogant condescension that he reserved exclusively for people he deemed socially and racially inferior. He smiled, a thin, tight line that did not reach his cold blue eyes. "Listen, sweetheart," Preston said, his tone dripping with patronizing faux sympathy. "You played the business game well for a few years. I will give you that. It is an impressive little urban hustle you built. But real estate and corporate acquisitions at this level are a man's game. You are out of your depth here. Sign the papers like a good girl. We are not completely heartless. We will write in a provision to give you a 5% allowance from the monthly profits. That way, you can still buy your little designer bags and pretend you are important at your brunch meetings. Do not make this ugly, Jada. You do not want to see how ugly I can make things for you." His words were designed to shrink me, to reduce my multi-million-dollar empire into a frivolous hobby. He wanted me to feel small, insignificant, and powerless in the face of his white male authority. He expected me to crumble under the weight of his intimidation, just as he forced small business owners to crumble during his aggressive property acquisitions. He expected the typical emotional reaction he could use to justify locking me away. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, surrounded by the four people who wanted to destroy my life. The silence stretched out thick and heavy. I let them bathe in the tension. I let them believe my hesitation was defeat. I looked at the broken pieces of my phone on the floor. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from my husband's face. I looked at the triumphant smirk on my sister's lips. I looked at the absolute indifference in my father's eyes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them a single ounce of the emotional breakdown they desperately needed to validate their psychiatric hold. Instead, I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold fountain pen resting beside the contract. The metal felt cool and solid in my hand. I rolled the pen between my fingers, testing its weight. I stepped closer to the mahogany desk, leaning over the document. I made sure to lock eyes with Darius before I moved the pen. His smirk widened slightly, believing he had finally broken me completely. He thought he had won the grand prize. He thought the money, the business, and my sister were all his for the taking. I lowered the pen to the signature line at the bottom of the page. With a smooth, steady hand, I signed my name with a massive, elegant flourish. The dark ink bled into the heavy paper, securing what they believed was the transfer of my entire corporate empire. I placed the pen back on the desk, aligning it perfectly parallel to the contract. I stood up straight, adjusting my blazer one final time. I looked around the room, making sure to meet each of their eyes, holding their gazes until they looked away or shifted uncomfortably. The sheer lack of panic in my demeanor was beginning to unsettle them. They had expected weeping and begging. They had expected me to fight for Darius' love or plead for my father's mercy. My absolute coldness was a variable they had not accounted for in their meticulous planning. "Enjoy the Empire, boys," I said, my voice steady and smooth. The chilling smile that spread across my face caused my father to take a small, involuntary step backward. I turned on my heel, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I did not rush. I did not look back. I walked out of the home office, down the grand hallway, and through the heavy front doors of the estate. The warm Atlanta evening air hit my face as I stepped out onto the driveway. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns. I walked to my car parked at the end of the circular driveway. My movements were precise and deliberate. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door, shutting out the world. Once I was safely inside the soundproof cabin of my vehicle, the mask of indifference dropped. My hands began to shake violently, but it was not from fear or sorrow. It was from pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I reached under the driver's seat, sliding my hand into a hidden compartment built into the floorboard. My fingers brushed against smooth plastic. I pulled out a secondary burner phone. It was a simple device, untraceable to my primary accounts but heavily encrypted. I powered the device on, watching the screen light up the dark interior of my car. I quickly navigated to a secure cloud application I had installed months ago when I first started suspecting Darius of moving money around our accounts. I held my breath as the application synced to the hidden servers. A small loading icon spun on the screen for what felt like an eternity. Then the file directory appeared. Right at the top of the list was a new audio file timestamped exactly 3 minutes ago. The live sync feature had worked flawlessly. Every word Darius spoke about the embezzled $500,000, every threat my father made about perjuring himself, every racist and sexist comment Preston delivered, and every confirmation of their conspiracy to commit me to a psychiatric facility had been captured. When Darius smashed my phone, he had only destroyed the physical hardware. The data had already been beamed into a secure remote vault that none of them could ever access or delete. I let out a long, shaky breath, resting my forehead against the steering wheel. The betrayal cut deep, agonizingly deep. My heart ached for the family I thought I had, for the marriage I believed was real. But the pain was quickly overshadowed by a fierce, burning determination. They wanted to play corporate warfare. They wanted to steal my life and lock me away in the dark. They had severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with. I lifted my head and opened the secure messaging app on the burner phone. I selected the contact for my lead corporate attorney, a brilliant, ruthless woman who handled all my high-level acquisitions and legal defense strategies. I quickly typed out a message, my thumbs flying across the small screen. "The rats took the bait," I wrote. "The audio is secured in the vault. They have the signed documents. Initiate protocol Genesis." I hit send and watched the message status change to delivered. A few seconds later, the read receipt appeared. My lawyer was already moving. Protocol Genesis was a contingency plan we had developed weeks ago just in case my suspicions about Darius proved true. I had not expected the conspiracy to involve my entire biological family, but the protocol would work just the same. They thought my signature on that paper was their golden ticket. They thought they had outsmarted me. What they did not know was that the signature they forced me to provide was the trigger for a legal trap, so devastating it would financially and socially ruin every single one of them. I placed the burner phone carefully into my purse. I started the engine, the deep hum of the motor breaking the silence of the evening. I pulled out of my father's driveway, not as a victim running away from a fight, but as a predator, preparing to burn their entire world to the ground. The countdown to their destruction had officially begun. As I drove down the winding tree-lined streets of Buckhead, the streetlights flickered on, casting long orange glows across the hood of my car. I kept the radio off, needing the absolute silence to organize my thoughts. The image of kissing Sierra kept flashing behind my eyes, like a corrupted film reel. 7 years of marriage. 7 years of building a life together, sharing dreams, celebrating anniversaries, and planning for a future that was nothing but a meticulously crafted illusion. I remembered how he had held me when I was stressed about opening my third office location, telling me he was my biggest supporter. All the while, he had been draining my accounts and sleeping with my sister. And Sierra, my beautiful vapid sister, who had spent her entire life competing with me for a prize I never even wanted. She had always viewed my success as a personal insult to her own existence. She could not stand that the sister who was deemed too dark, too plain, and too stubborn had built a real empire while she relied on a racist husband to fund her lifestyle. Stealing Darius was not about love for her. It was about conquering me. It was about proving she could still take whatever I cherished most. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned a pale ashen color. I thought about Vernon, the man who had biological responsibility for my existence, but possessed absolutely zero paternal instinct. He had traded my freedom for the erasure of his gambling debts without a second of hesitation. He had orchestrated my institutionalization to save his own pride. I pulled up to the security gates of my own property. The heavy iron gates swung open, welcoming me into the fortress I had paid for with my own sweat and blood. I parked the car in the expansive garage, cutting the engine. I sat in the darkness for a long time, letting the reality of my new solitary existence wash over me. I was completely alone now. I had no husband, no father, and no sister. The family tree had been entirely poisoned from the roots to the highest branches. But I also had no more illusions. I had no more blind spots. I stepped out of the car and walked into my empty, silent house. I bypassed the grand living room and walked straight up the sweeping staircase to my home office. I bypassed the photos of Darius and me smiling on vacations that now felt like crime scenes. I sat down at my desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad. I uncapped a pen and began to write out the timeline for the next 30 days. I needed to act exactly as they expected me to act. I needed to play the role of the defeated, broken woman. I would let Darius take the CEO chair. I would let Preston parade my assets around his investor meetings. I would let them bloat themselves on their own arrogance. They were going to climb so high on the ladder of my stolen success that the fall would inevitably break their necks. I smiled to myself in the quiet, empty room. The rats had indeed taken the bait, and the trap was perfectly set. 1 month passed since the day I signed away my company in my father's dark cedar closet. 30 days of playing the perfect defeated victim. It was the most demanding performance of my entire life, but the payoff was going to be magnificent. Darius moved into my executive suite at Lux Haven the very next morning. He replaced my minimalist furniture with heavy, obnoxious leather pieces that screamed false authority. He thought he was a king finally sitting on the throne he deserved. In reality, he was just a clown playing in a burning castle. He wasted no time bleeding the accounts dry. I watched from my hidden servers as he authorized ridiculous expenses. He bought himself a custom matte black sports car within the first week, claiming it was a necessary business expense for client meetings. Then came the massive outward wire transfers to a shell company I knew belonged to Sierra. He was single-handedly funding her failing lifestyle influencer brand. Her engagement metrics had been tanking for months. But suddenly, she had the budget to fly to Dubai for photo shoots and buy fake followers by the thousands. The money he was using was supposed to be for my employees' payroll and warehouse expansion. But Darius did not care. He was blinded by his own greed and his pathetic obsession with my sister. At home, I played my part flawlessly. I stopped wearing makeup. I walked around our Buckhead mansion in an oversized cashmere robe, clutching a mug of herbal tea. I made sure to leave empty prescription bottles of anxiety medication on the bathroom counter where Darius could see them. The pills were actually just vitamin supplements, but Darius never looked closely enough to notice. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust whenever he came home late from his supposed business meetings. He would pat my head and tell me to get some rest while he went to the guest bedroom to text Sierra. He completely bought the illusion that I was a broken woman too heavily medicated to fight back. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the front door chimed. I was sitting in the living room staring blankly at the television when Sierra walked in unannounced. She had always possessed a profound lack of respect for my personal boundaries, but today she brought a new level of absolute audacity. She strutted into my living room wearing a skin-tight designer dress and holding a massive designer handbag. But it was not the dress or the bag that caught my attention. It was the jewelry resting against her collarbone. She was wearing a stunning $50,000 diamond tennis necklace. It was not just any necklace. It was a custom piece I had designed for myself late last year to celebrate my company hitting its first major revenue milestone. I had kept it safely locked in my personal safe in the master bedroom, a safe that Darius had the combination to. He had stolen my jewelry and gifted it to his mistress, who also happened to be my sister. Sierra sat down on the sofa across from me, crossing her long legs and sighing heavily, as if her life was incredibly difficult. She looked at my bare face and my messy bun with poorly concealed satisfaction. "You look so tired, sis," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You really have let yourself go this past month. It is a good thing Darius stepped up and took the burden of leadership off your shoulders. You never were smart enough to scale that business anyway. You were always just playing decorator while the real adults did the heavy lifting." I took a slow sip of my chamomile tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat. I did not react to the insult. I kept my expression perfectly blank, vacant, and submissive. That was exactly what she needed to see to feel secure in her stolen victory. "I am just resting, Sierra," I replied softly, keeping my eyes focused on the diamond necklace sparkling under the living room lights. She noticed my gaze and immediately reached up to touch the diamonds, a smug smile spreading across her face. "It is beautiful, is it not?" she asked, tracing the stones with a perfectly manicured finger. "Preston bought it for me to celebrate our upcoming anniversary. He always knows exactly what I want. He says a woman of my status deserves to shine." It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to laugh out loud at the absurdity of her lie. Preston was completely broke. His real estate projects were sinking, and he was facing multiple lawsuits from unpaid contractors. He could not afford a $50 necklace right now, let alone a $50,000 custom diamond piece. Darius had stolen it from my safe to keep Sierra happy, and Sierra was proudly flaunting it in my face, believing I was too medicated and stupid to recognize my own property. She leaned back against the cushions, looking around my home with a critical eye. You know, Jada, seeing you like this reminds me of our high school prom. Do you remember that night? I remembered it vividly. It was the night my father made it abundantly clear exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. You were so upset, she continued, a cruel amusement dancing in her eyes. You had saved up your money from working at that terrible fast food place to buy a dress. But then my dress got ruined at the dry cleaners the day before the dance. Dad was so panicked because I was up for prom queen and I needed to look perfect. He took your money and combined it with his own to buy me that gorgeous $2,000 gown from the boutique downtown. He made you wear my old hand-me-down dress from 2 years prior. It was 2 sizes too big for you and completely out of style. She laughed, a light, airy sound that grated against my ears. You cried the entire night, hiding in the bathroom while I was crowned queen. Dad told you to stop being selfish and to support your sister. It is funny how history repeats itself, is it not? Dad knew back then that you were not meant for the spotlight, and he knows it now. You are just not built for success, Jada. I always end up with the best things. It is just the natural order of our family. She sat there radiating pure, unadulterated entitlement. She truly believed that the universe existed solely to serve her, and that my pain was just a necessary byproduct of her happiness. She had spent her entire life stealing my joy, my resources, and my peace of mind, simply because our father allowed it. And now she thought she had stolen my husband and my multi-million-dollar company. I slowly lowered my teacup to the glass coffee table. The ceramic made a soft clinking sound in the quiet room. I looked up, meeting her eyes directly. For the first time in a month, I let the vacant medicated mask slip just a fraction of an inch. I let her see the cold, calculating woman underneath. It looks heavy, Sierra, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, dark whisper. The necklace, I mean. Make sure it does not choke you. Sierra's smile faltered for a brief second. A flash of confusion crossed her face as she processed the sudden shift in my tone. She reached up and touched the diamonds again, suddenly looking a little less comfortable in my living room. She opened her mouth to say something, probably another insult, but she was interrupted by the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside. We both looked toward the front window. A sleek black delivery van had pulled up to the security gate. A man wearing a crisp, dark uniform stepped out holding a thick, rigid envelope. Sierra stood up, smoothing down her dress. Her arrogant confidence quickly returning to mask her momentary discomfort. Well, I should get going, she announced, grabbing her purse. I have a highly exclusive dress fitting for the gala tomorrow night. Preston and I are celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary at the St. Regis. It is going to be the social event of the season. Half of the city council and dozens of venture capitalists will be there. Darius is going to officially announce the integration of Lux Haven into Preston's real estate portfolio. You should probably just stay home and rest, Jada. The noise and the crowds would be way too much for your fragile mental state right now. She gave me one last mocking look of pity before turning and walking out the front door, passing the delivery courier on the front porch. I watched her climb into her luxury SUV and drive away, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about to collapse. The doorbell rang. I stood up, shedding the oversized cashmere robe, letting it fall to the floor. Underneath, I was wearing a sharp-tailored outfit, completely ready for business. I walked to the front door and opened it. Jada Adams, the courier asked, holding out an electronic tablet. That is me, I replied. I need your signature here, please, for a secure delivery. I signed my name on the screen and he handed me the thick sealed envelope. It bore the official seal of a federal agency. I thanked him and closed the door, leaning my back against the heavy wood. The house was completely silent again. I looked down at the package in my hands. I did not need to open it to know what was inside, but I broke the seal anyway, just to feel the satisfying weight of the paper. I pulled out the documents. The bold red stamps across the top of the pages confirmed everything my corporate lawyer had promised. My plan had moved through the legal system perfectly without a single hitch. Darius and Preston had taken the bait, swallowed the hook, and practically begged to be reeled in. They had submitted the fraudulent power of attorney to secure their massive commercial loan, just as I predicted they would. They had tied their personal and professional lives to a company they did not legally own. I walked back into the living room and picked up my teacup. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out over the sprawling, manicured lawns of my estate. The sun was shining brightly over Atlanta. Tomorrow night, Preston and Sierra would host their extravagant anniversary gala. They would stand in front of the wealthiest people in the city and attempt to publicly humiliate me one final time. They would try to cement their theft and celebrate their victory. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had truly smiled in a month. I thought about Darius sitting in my office playing CEO. I thought about Preston bragging to his investors about his new acquisition. I thought about Sierra proudly wearing my stolen diamonds around her neck. They were all so blindly confident in their own supremacy. They had no idea that the documents resting in my hand were the financial equivalent of a nuclear bomb. They had no idea that their elegant celebration tomorrow night was going to serve as their public execution. The stage was perfectly set. The actors were all in position. The illusion of their control was absolute and unbreakable, and I was going to tear it all down. I closed the curtains and walked upstairs to pick out my very best outfit for tomorrow. I needed it to look absolutely flawless. It was the perfect attire for attending a funeral masquerading as an anniversary party. The morning of the gala arrived with a heavy, humid Atlanta heat that seemed to cling to the tall windows of my silent estate. I spent the entire day preparing for the evening with the meticulous focus of a general planning a military siege. There was absolutely no room for error. Every single detail of my appearance needed to send a very specific message to the people who thought they had buried me alive. I had hired a private styling team to come to the house, ensuring that when I walked through the doors of the St. Regis Hotel, no one would see the medicated broken woman my family had gleefully described to their high society friends. My styling team pulled my dark hair back into a severe, sleek ponytail that pulled the skin around my cheekbones tight. My makeup was sharp and flawless with a deep crimson lip color that looked like fresh blood. I stepped into a custom-tailored emerald green power suit with sharp architectural shoulders and a plunging neckline that screamed absolute unyielding authority. I paired it with gold stiletto heels that clicked against the hardwood floor like bullets being loaded into a chamber. I did not look like a woman seeking a psychiatric evaluation or a quiet corner to cry in. I looked like an executioner ready to deliver a final verdict. The drive to the luxury hotel in Buckhead gave me plenty of time to clear my mind and review the sequence of events my legal team had set into motion. The timing of this night had to be absolute perfection. As my hired black car pulled up to the valet, the flashing lights of local society photographers illuminated the humid evening air. This was considered the event of the season for the Atlanta elite. Politicians, venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, and minor celebrities were all gathered to celebrate Preston and Sierra's 5th wedding anniversary. But it was never truly just an anniversary party. It was a highly orchestrated public relations stunt designed to secure a massive commercial loan using my stolen company as collateral to save Preston's sinking empire. I stepped out of the car and the thick, humid air hit my face. I ignored the shouting photographers and walked gracefully up the grand marble steps of the hotel. The grand ballroom was decorated with an obnoxious amount of white orchids and towering crystal centerpieces that caught the light from the chandeliers. It was exactly the kind of tasteless, over-the-top display Preston loved to use to mask his actual lack of financial liquidity. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms circulated through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and tiny caviar hors d'oeuvres. The room buzzed with the sound of a live string quartet and the loud, arrogant laughter of men who truly thought they owned the city and everyone in it. I grabbed a tall glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near a towering ice sculpture wrapped in green ivy. I stood in the shadows quietly observing the room. It did not take long to spot them. Right in the center of the massive ballroom holding court, under the largest crystal chandelier, were Preston and Sierra. Sierra was wearing a silver sequined gown that hugged every curve and left very little to the imagination. And resting proudly against her collarbone, catching the light with every movement, was my stolen custom diamond tennis necklace. She was laughing loudly, tossing her head back and soaking up the attention and praise of the local socialites who flocked around her. Darius was standing just a few feet away, holding a heavy glass of amber scotch. He was playing the role of the supportive brother-in-law, perfectly mingling with Preston's wealthy business partners and smiling his charming fake smile. But from my hidden vantage point, I could see the subtle, filthy movements they thought they were hiding from the world. I watched the way Darius let his hand brush intimately against the small of Sierra's, back when Preston turned away to shake hands with a city councilman. I saw the lingering, hungry glances they shared across the cocktail tables when they thought no one was paying attention. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and perceived victory that they actually thought they were invisible to consequence. I slowly began to walk toward the center of the room, letting the guests finally notice my arrival. Heads turned and shocked whispers began to ripple through the crowd like a tidal wave. They had all heard the vicious rumors my family had carefully planted about my supposed mental breakdown. They fully expected to see a fragile, trembling woman who could barely put a coherent sentence together. Instead, they saw a predator walking gracefully through her hunting grounds. Conversation stopped completely as I glided past the elegant tables. Women leaned in to whisper behind their champagne flutes and men stared in uncomfortable, bewildered silence. Before I could reach the main stage where the presentations were supposed to happen, my father intercepted me. Vernon stepped out from behind a massive floral arrangement and clamped his heavy, sweating hand around my upper arm. His grip was deliberately bruising, but I did not flinch or pull away immediately. He pulled me roughly into a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the kitchen service doors, far away from the prying eyes of his wealthy country club friends. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his eyes darting around nervously to see if anyone was watching us. "You were supposed to stay home, Jada. You are in no condition to attend a high-profile corporate event like this." I looked down at his large hand gripping the fine emerald silk of my sleeve, and then slowly raised my eyes to meet his furious gaze. "Remove your hand from my arm, father," I said, my voice dangerously quiet and completely devoid of any emotion or fear. He dropped his hand as if the silk had burned him, but leaned in closer, his face red with suppressed panic and absolute anger. His breath smelled heavily of expensive gin and desperate fear. "Keep your mouth shut tonight, Jada," he warned, pointing a thick, shaking finger at my chest. "Preston is closing a massive commercial deal with these federal investors tonight. This merger with your company is the absolute only thing keeping his real estate portfolio afloat and saving us all from ruin. His investors are looking for stability and strength. Do not ruin this family's moment with one of your pathetic emotional outbursts. If you make a scene, I will have hotel security drag you out of here and take you straight to the psychiatric hospital myself." I smoothed out the fabric of my sleeve where his heavy hand had wrinkled it. I looked at the man who had spent his entire life valuing the opinions of rich strangers over the well-being and safety of his own daughter. I offered him a chilling, perfectly composed smile that made him swallow hard. "I would not dream of ruining the moment." "Father," I replied smoothly, taking a slow, calm sip of my sparkling water. "I am just here to watch the show unfold. You told me to be a supportive family member, and that is exactly what I am doing tonight." Vernon narrowed his eyes clearly, unsettled by my calm and steady demeanor, but the loud chime of a glass being tapped with a spoon echoed through the expansive ballroom. It was time for the announcements to begin. Vernon straightened his tie, wiped the sweat from his forehead, gave me one last warning glare, and hurried back to the VIP tables at the very front of the room. I followed at a much more leisurely pace, finding a quiet spot near the center aisle where I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the massive stage. The elegant chandelier lights in the ballroom slowly dimmed, and a bright white spotlight illuminated the main stage. The string quartet stopped playing, and a heavy, expectant hush fell over the hundreds of guests. Preston confidently strutted up the carpeted stairs to the microphone, adjusting his expensive designer tuxedo jacket. Sierra glided up the stairs right behind him, smiling brightly and waving for the cameras like a pageant winner claiming her crown. Darius stood at the very edge of the stage, looking incredibly pleased with himself, nodding to wealthy investors in the front row. Preston tapped the microphone, sending a small thumping sound through the state-of-the-art sound system. He cleared his throat and flashed a bright, highly artificial smile to the wealthy crowd before him. Good evening, friends, family, and esteemed corporate partners. Preston began his voice with unearned authority and smug satisfaction. Thank you all for gathering here tonight to celebrate 5 wonderful years of marriage with my truly beautiful wife, Sierra. But tonight is not just about our personal milestones. It is about the economic future of our great city and the tremendous growth of our corporate family. Polite applause rippled through the luxurious room. Preston held up a manicured hand asking for silence so he could continue his performance. As many of you know, my core business philosophy has always been about community, upliftment, and supporting those who lack the natural resources, intellect, or stamina to succeed in this harsh corporate landscape, Preston announced, pausing to make sure he looked deeply sincere. Tonight, I am absolutely thrilled to announce the official acquisition and merger of Lux Haven into our massive corporate real estate portfolio. Lux Haven was a struggling minority-owned design business founded by my dear sister-in-law Jada. He paused again, letting a look of deeply insulting mock sympathy wash over his face. Sierra put a delicate hand to her chest, playing the role of the concerned, loving sister perfectly for the audience. Unfortunately, as some of you may have heard in recent weeks, Jada had to step down from her role due to severe mental health reasons and extreme emotional exhaustion. The pressures of real business simply became way too much for her delicate condition to handle. We ask for your continued prayers for her recovery during this incredibly difficult time. But I am extremely proud to say that under my superior executive management and the brilliant financial guidance of my colleague and brother-in-law, Darius, we are going to take her cute little urban hustle and turn it into a real powerful corporate asset. Please give a warm round of applause for Jada, for knowing exactly when to step aside and let the men handle the heavy lifting. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his racist and sexist speech was almost impressive. He was publicly humiliating me in front of the entire city, reducing my years of brilliant strategic work into a cute hustle while demanding applause for blatantly stealing it. A smattering of polite, highly confused applause rippled through the audience. Some people clapped enthusiastically, while others looked around uncomfortably, sensing the terrible tension in the room. Darius stood off to the side, clapping his hands and beaming with pride. My father nodded approvingly from his front row seat, acting like the proud patriarch. Preston raised his hands again, silencing the sparse, uncomfortable applause. He pulled a small black remote control from his tuxedo pocket, holding it high in the air for everyone to see. And now, my friends and valued investors, I would like to officially unveil our newly merged corporate logo to symbolize this historic acquisition, he declared triumphantly. He clicked the remote, pointing it directly toward the massive LED screens suspended high above the stage. Everyone in the room tilted their heads up, expecting to see a sleek new graphic design representing their stolen empire. The photographers raised their cameras, ready to capture the glorious moment of triumph. Instead, the massive screens flickered wildly. A loud, piercing burst of static hissed through the sound system, making several wealthy guests wince and cover their ears in pain. The screens went completely pitch black for 2 agonizingly long seconds. Preston frowned, tapping the remote again, looking highly annoyed at the unexpected technical glitch. Darius stepped forward, looking confused and slightly panicked. Then an image flashed onto the screen, so incredibly large and bright that it illuminated the entire dark ballroom in a harsh, blinding red glow. It was not a newly designed corporate logo. It was a highly magnified, scanned copy of a massive official government document stamped with bright red block letters. Everyone in the room gasped collectively, a wave of genuine shock sweeping through the elite crowd as they read the bold text at the top of the illuminated screen. It was a federal freeze and seizure warrant from the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The document explicitly detailed immediate asset seizure due to suspected wire fraud, bank fraud, and international money laundering, and printed clearly in the exact center of the massive warrant for every single high society guest, venture capitalist, and local politician to read were the names Preston Vance and Darius Vance. The elegant music was dead. The polite applause was entirely gone. The illusion of their power, their wealth, and their absolute control was officially over. The room descended into absolute stunned silence as the glowing red letters burned the undeniable truth into the walls of the ballroom, illuminating the absolute horror dawning on Preston's pale face. The harsh red light from the massive LED screens reflected directly off the $50,000 diamond tennis necklace resting on Sierra's chest, making the stolen stones look like drops of fresh blood. Preston slowly turned his head to look at the screen, his mouth falling open in a silent scream of pure terror. He dropped the small black remote control, letting it clatter loudly against the wooden stage floor. Darius staggered backward, gripping the edge of the podium, as if his legs could no longer support his own weight. He stared at his name printed in bold black ink next to the words Federal Wire Fraud, and his amber Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering into 100 pieces, just like the screen of my phone he had destroyed a month ago. The wealthy investors in the front row, who had been ready to hand Preston millions of dollars, suddenly began backing away from the stage as if the men standing on it were highly contagious. Politicians who had been smiling for photographs just moments before quickly turned their faces away, desperate to distance themselves from a federal crime scene. The air in the St. Regis ballroom turned freezing cold as the reality of the situation crashed down upon my family. Their entire empire, built on lies, theft, and manipulation, was crumbling to dust in front of the entire city. The harsh red light from the massive LED screens bathed the entire ballroom in the color of consequence. Every single person in that room was frozen, trapped in a collective state of absolute shock. Preston was staring up at the federal freeze and seizure warrant, with his mouth hanging open, his arrogant facade completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Darius looked like he was going to vomit right there on the stage, his hands gripping the wooden podium so tightly that his knuckles were stark white against his dark skin. The wealthy investors sitting in the front row, the same men who had just been clapping for my supposed downfall, were now whispering frantically to each other, their faces pale with panic. They knew exactly what a federal warrant meant, and they knew their money was currently tied to the two men standing on that stage. I did not wait for Preston or Darius to recover their senses. I stepped out from the center aisle and began walking toward the stage, my gold stiletto heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor before hitting the plush carpet of the stairs. The crowd parted for me instantly, creating a wide, clear path. They looked at me not with pity, but with a sudden profound realization that they were witnessing a masterclass in corporate destruction. I walked up the carpeted stairs, my emerald green suit catching the dim light. My posture was perfectly straight, my head held high. I was not the medicated broken wife they had been told about. I was the architect of their ruin. Preston finally noticed me approaching. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sheer terror. He tried to speak, to command me to stop, but no words came out of his mouth. He was completely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his reality. I walked directly up to the podium and smoothly slid the microphone out of its stand. Darius tried to reach out to stop me, his hand trembling violently, but he lacked the strength to even touch my sleeve. He looked at me with pleading, desperate eyes, begging me silently to make the nightmare stop. I ignored him completely, turning my attention to the hundreds of elite guests who were hanging on my every move. "Thank you for the introduction, Preston," I said, my voice echoing clearly and calmly through the massive ballroom sound system. It was a very passionate speech. But there is a slight error in your presentation that I feel needs to be corrected for the sake of the investors in this room. The silence in the St. Regis ballroom was so absolute that I could hear the sharp intake of breath from my father sitting in the front row. Vernon was gripping the arms of his chair, his face a mask of absolute horror. He knew whatever I was about to say was going to destroy the legacy he cared so much about. "You see, Preston stood up here and told you all that he acquired my company Luxhaven." I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, making sure to make eye contact with the most powerful venture capitalists in the room. "He told you that my husband Darius used a power of attorney to transfer my assets, my real estate and my intellectual property, into Preston's corporate portfolio. He told you that I willingly signed my empire away because I was mentally unfit to lead." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the crowd. I glanced back at Sierra, who was clutching her chest, her eyes darting between me and the massive red warrant on the screen above us. The $50,000 diamond tennis necklace around her neck looked incredibly heavy now. It is true that I signed a document in my father's office exactly 1 month ago. I said, my voice smooth and conversational. I signed a complete business handover contract and an irrevocable power of attorney giving Darius full executive control of everything I owned. I watched them celebrate their victory. I watched them drain the company accounts to buy sports cars and fund failing social media brands. I let them believe they had won. Preston finally found his voice, though it was weak and shaking. "Jada, shut up," he hissed, stepping toward me. "Turn that screen off right now, or I swear to God." "Or what?" Preston, I asked, turning to face him, my expression completely devoid of fear. "You will lock me in a psychiatric ward. You will ruin my reputation. You already tried that and look where it got you." I turned back to the audience, my voice rising with undeniable authority. "The error in Preston's presentation is incredibly simple. The documents I signed 1 month ago were completely and entirely worthless. They were nothing but expensive scrap paper." Darius let out a choked gasp, shaking his head back and forth. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The lawyers verified the signatures. The transfer was legal. The transfer would have been legal. Darius, if I actually owned the company. When I signed those papers," I replied, offering him a chilling smile. "But I did not own Lux Haven. I did not own the commercial real estate. I did not own the staging inventory, or the intellectual property. Technically, on the night you cornered me in my father's office and forced me to sign my life away, I owned absolutely nothing on paper." A loud murmur rippled through the crowd as the wealthy investors began to connect the dots. I raised my hand to quiet them down, needing them to hear every single detail of my trap. 6 months ago, I began to notice some troubling discrepancies in our joint savings accounts. I explained, pacing slowly back toward the center of the stage. I suspected my husband of embezzling funds to support his hidden gambling debts and his lavish affairs. So I took immediate protective action. I hired a team of elite corporate attorneys and legally transferred 100% of Lux Haven's assets into an irrevocable blind trust stationed in Delaware. I looked directly at my father, who was now sweating profusely, his hands shaking violently in his lap. "I named the trust after my late mother's maiden name to ensure none of you would ever find it in a standard asset search," I continued. "I removed myself as the legal owner and positioned myself merely as a contracted employee of the trust. So when you forced me to sign that power of attorney, I was granting you control over assets that had already vanished 6 months prior." The realization hit Preston like a physical blow. His knees actually buckled and he had to grab the edge of the podium to keep from collapsing onto the stage floor. His face turned an ashen, sickly color as the magnitude of his mistake finally registered in his arrogant brain. "You used an invalid, fraudulent document to claim ownership of a company that belonged to a blind trust," I said, my voice ringing with cold, hard justice. "But that is not the worst part, Preston. The worst part is what you did with that fake ownership." I turned to address the front row of investors, the men who had been ready to pour millions into Preston's failing real estate empire. "Because you and Darius used that invalid piece of paper to secure a $15 million commercial loan from the investors in this very room," I announced, pointing directly at the men in the front row. "You used assets you did not own to guarantee federal funds. You did not acquire a company, Preston. You committed federal bank fraud and wire fraud." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Several investors leaped out of their seats, shouting angrily at Preston and calling for their legal teams. Politicians scrambled toward the exits, desperate to avoid the inevitable media fallout. The polite high society gala had instantly transformed into a frantic crime scene. Darius fell to his knees on the stage, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. He knew his life was over. Federal wire fraud carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would ensure he spent the next decade in a federal penitentiary. His investment banking career, his lavish lifestyle, his entire identity was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. But Sierra was not willing to accept defeat. She had spent her entire life being shielded from consequences, and she truly believed she could bully her way out of this nightmare. She stomped across the stage, her silver sequined gown flashing under the harsh red light of the warrant screen. Her face was contorted with an ugly, vicious rage that destroyed any trace of her former pageant queen beauty. "You lying witch!" she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, echoing over the chaos of the evacuating ballroom. "You set us up. You planned this whole thing to ruin my anniversary. You have always been jealous of me, Jada." She lunged at me, raising her hand to strike my face. She fully intended to slap me right there on the stage in front of the remaining guests. But I was not the quiet, submissive sister anymore. I did not flinch or back away. As her hand swung toward my cheek, I simply raised my arm and caught her wrist in midair. My grip was like a steel vise. I held her wrist effortlessly, stopping her violent momentum instantly. She gasped, trying to pull away, but I held firm, letting her feel the absolute physical and emotional power I now held over her. I looked deep into her panicked eyes, seeing the fragile, insecure little girl hiding beneath the layers of expensive makeup and stolen jewelry. "Careful, Sierra," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that only she could hear over the screaming crowd. "Violence will only add assault to your growing list of legal problems." I slowly let go of her wrist, pushing her hand away with a look of pure disgust. She stumbled backward, clutching her arm, staring at me as if I were a monster she had never seen before. She looked down at Darius sobbing on the floor, and then over to Preston, who was currently surrounded by furious, screaming investors, demanding their money back. "You destroyed my life," Sierra sobbed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Preston is going to lose everything because of you. We are going to be ruined." "You ruined yourselves," I corrected her calmly, smoothing my blazer. "I just provided the rope you used to hang your own empire. And speaking of losing everything, Sierra, you might want to call your housekeeper right now." Sierra blinked through her tears, looking at me with pure confusion and mounting dread. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. I offered her the coldest, most unforgiving smile of my entire life. I took a step closer, looking directly at the $50,000 diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. The same necklace Darius had stolen from my safe to buy her affection. "By the way," I said, my tone light and conversational, "the police are currently at your mansion, seizing everything bought with that fraudulent loan. The sports cars, the designer bags, the furniture, and every single piece of jewelry Darius purchased using stolen corporate funds. They are taking everything." I continued, watching her entire world collapse around her. "They are boxing up all of your custom shoes and expensive bags are being loaded into evidence trucks to pay back the victims of your husband's massive financial crimes. So I highly suggest you take off that particular diamond necklace right this very second before the federal agents inevitably storm into this building and physically rip it from your neck in public tonight, Sierra." The chaos in the Sturgis ballroom was a living, breathing entity now. Wealthy investors were still scrambling toward the exit doors, their expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished marble as they desperately tried to distance themselves from the federal fraud taking place on the main stage. But the show was far from over. While Preston stared at the glowing red seizure warrant with vacant, horrified eyes, and Darius continued to sob openly on the floor, the real architect of my lifelong misery finally decided to make his presence known to the highly shocked and completely silent standing crowd. My father, Vernon, who had spent his entire life curating an image of the perfect, affluent black patriarch, could no longer hide behind his tailored suit and his fake country club smile. The realization that his carefully constructed legacy was burning to ash right in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta completely shattered whatever remaining restraint he possessed. He leaped from his front row seat, his face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his silk collar as he charged toward the stage stairs with absolute fury in his dark, cold eyes. He did not look like a retired city councilman anymore. He looked like a wild, desperate animal cornered by the truth. He stomped up the carpeted stairs, ignoring the shocked gasps of the few guests who had remained to watch the spectacle unfold. His heavy breathing echoed through the microphone I was holding in my right hand. He marched directly toward me, his large hands reaching out violently to rip the microphone from my grasp. He fully intended to silence me by physical force, just as he had silenced my dreams and my voice for many long, agonizing, painful years. But I was not the frightened little girl hiding in a cedar closet anymore. As his hand lunged towards the microphone, I simply took a smooth, calculated step backward, letting his heavy hand grasp nothing but empty air. His momentum carried him forward and he stumbled slightly, his expensive shoes scuffing awkwardly against the wooden stage. He caught himself before he could fall completely, but the physical misstep only fueled his absolute raging embarrassment. He glared at me with a hatred so pure it could have melted the huge ice sculptures sitting in the Grand Hotel lobby entirely into puddles. "Shut up, Jada," he roared, his voice raw and shaking with absolute fury. "You are destroying my legacy. You are ruining the family name in front of the entire city. Turn off that screen right now before you do permanent damage to all of us." He pointed a trembling finger at me, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his footing and his fractured authority. "I co-signed that massive commercial loan to help your brother-in-law because you were too incredibly selfish to help this family." He spat the ugly words exactly like lethal, toxic, bitter poison. "You refused to share your wealth, so I had to step in as the head of this household to save Preston's projects. You forced us to do this, Jada. You are the reason this is happening to us." It was the exact same manipulative tactic he had used my entire life. No matter what crimes they committed, no matter how deeply they betrayed me, it was always somehow framed as my fault. They stole my company, and it was my fault for being selfish. They plotted to lock me in a psychiatric ward for money and complete financial control forever. It was my fault for being emotional. Vernon was standing on a stage underneath a federal warrant for wire fraud, and he was still trying to gaslight me into taking the blame for his own criminal actions. I looked at the man who had given me half of my DNA. I looked at the heavy sweat pouring down his wrinkled forehead and the absolute undeniable panic destroying his dark eyes. I felt absolutely no pity for him. I felt no lingering familial obligation to protect his reputation. I only felt the cold, sharp edge of pure and absolute poetic justice. "Your legacy, father?" I asked, my voice echoing smoothly through the ballroom, completely unmoved by his violent outburst. "Let us take a very close look at exactly how you built this pristine legacy of yours over the past decade." I reached into the pocket of my emerald green blazer and pulled out a secondary remote control. I had explicitly instructed my technical team to prepare multiple diagnostic slides for this exact specific moment. I pressed a single button, and the massive LED screen suspended high above the stage immediately shifted, displaying something completely entirely new and utterly devastatingly different tonight. The federal freeze and seizure warrant faded away, seamlessly replaced by a complex, deeply detailed financial spreadsheet. The numbers were highlighted in bright yellow, tracking millions of dollars flowing through various hidden offshore bank accounts over the course of a very long decade. The few remaining guests in the ballroom leaned forward, squinting their eyes to read the glowing yellow numbers. Vernon slowly turned around to look at the massive screen, and the warm color completely drained from his already pale face. He staggered backward, clutching his chest, as if he had been physically struck incredibly intensely hard by me. "You see, everyone?" I said, pacing slowly across the front of the stage, making sure my voice reached every single dark corner of the room. "My father just claimed that he merely co-signed a commercial loan to help his struggling son-in-law. He desperately wants you to believe he is a noble patriarch, making selfless sacrifices for his beloved family. But the financial trail displayed clearly on this screen tells a very different, very tragic, and highly illegal story." I gestured gracefully toward the glowing numbers, walking toward the very edge of the stage to speak to everyone. 10 years ago, my father gained unfettered access to a specific private account. It was a massive life insurance policy left behind by my deceased mother. She had set up an ironclad trust meant exclusively for my future, my college education, and my long-term financial security. It was my rightful inheritance and the only thing I had left of her. Vernon began to shake violently, his hands trembling as he reached out toward me in pure desperation. "Jada, please do not do this," he begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic broken whisper, begging me to just stop now. Please keep this in the family. We can fix this quietly today. We stopped being a family a long time ago, Vernon. I replied coldly, turning my back on him to address the whispering crowd. For the last 10 long years, my father has been illegally draining my maternal inheritance. He systematically forged my signature on trust distributions, moving hundreds of thousands of dollars out of my secure accounts and washing the money through a series of local shell companies that he set up under fake names. Sierra, who was still clutching her arm, stared in sheer, absolute, unadulterated horror. She had always confidently believed our father's wealth was boundless and naturally derived from his political career. She had absolutely no idea where the money funding her lavish life actually came from today. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger to specific line items on the massive display. "See this massive transfer from exactly 6 years ago?" I asked the captive audience. "That $75,000 withdrawal from my mother's life insurance policy went directly to purchasing Sierra's first luxury sports car. And look closely at this series of wire transfers from 4 years ago, totaling incredibly, extremely, massively big, over $300,000 in stolen funds. That money was pumped directly into Preston's first failing commercial real estate venture to keep him from declaring corporate bankruptcy." Preston looked up from the wooden podium, his face a mask of sick, horrifying realization. He had built his arrogant, powerful real estate developer persona entirely on the back of my stolen inheritance. The unearned white privilege he constantly flaunted in my face had been entirely funded by the money my black mother had left behind to protect me from the harsh realities of the cruel corporate business development financial brutal world. But the most interesting withdrawals. I continued, my voice dropping an octave as I turned slowly back to look, my father dead in his terrified eyes, are the continuous monthly transfers sent to an offshore account in the Bahamas. Those consistent monthly transfers account for nearly $2 million of my stolen inheritance over the past 10 years. Vernon fell to his knees on the stage, openly weeping now. The mighty retired city councilman was reduced to a sobbing, broken mess in front of his wealthy peers and former colleagues. His broad, hunched shoulders shook as reality finally completely hit. My father did not just use my money to spoil his golden child and prop up his racist, incompetent son-in-law. I said, the absolute disgust vividly evident in my sharp tone. He used my mother's legacy to secretly pay off his massive underground sports gambling debts. He has been a chronic gambling addict for decades, meticulously hiding his constant losses behind his pristine political image while quietly bleeding my future dry to keep the local bookies from breaking his legs. The remaining guests gasped audibly, whispering frantically to each other behind their heavily jeweled, rich, wealthy, manicured hands. The scandal unfolding was beyond anything the Atlanta elite had ever witnessed in their entire lives. They were watching the complete, systematic dismantling of a powerful, prominent family in real time on a beautifully decorated stage. I walked slowly over to where Vernon was kneeling on the carpeted stage floor. I looked down at him, remembering all the countless times he had made me feel incredibly small, all the times he had told me I would never amount to anything in the business world. "You blamed me, my whole long, miserable, sad, lonely, difficult, heavy, tragic, terrible, painful, ruined life." I said, my voice low and dangerous, meant only for him, and the sensitive microphones picking up every single word. "You looked at me and saw the sole reason she was gone. You used my mere existence as a convenient excuse to treat me like a personal bank and to treat Sierra like an untouchable queen. You told me I lacked discipline when you were the one gambling away millions in the dark. Your entire legacy is nothing but stolen money and cheap, transparent lies." Vernon could not even look up at me from the beautifully polished wooden stage floor. He just kept sobbing uncontrollably, his sweaty forehead pressed tightly against the stage floor, muttering broken, useless apologies that meant absolutely nothing to me now. The severe psychological damage he had done could not be erased by tears he shed only because his crimes were finally caught. Darius, who was still sitting slumped on the floor nearby, had been listening to the entire revelation in a state of absolute frozen panic. Realizing He is facing federal prison for his part in the fraud. Darius starts to completely, totally, utterly, and entirely frantically, unbreakably, painfully, horribly, and deeply, massively, fiercely, panic. He scrambles to his feet, throwing Preston under the bus in front of everyone. "I did not want to do it, Preston blackmailed me." Darius screams, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "He forced me to sign those papers and move the money." Preston whips around his face, turning a dark, violent shade of red. "You worthless coward," Preston roars, stepping toward him with fists completely clenched. "Do you want me to tell them where your half of the money really went? Do you want Sierra to know exactly what kind of sick, twisted, degenerate criminal secrets you constantly hide?" The desperate scream from Darius echoed through the grand ballroom, tearing through the heavy silence that had fallen over the crowd. He was kneeling on the polished wooden stage, pointing a trembling finger directly at the man he had been calling his brother and business partner just an hour ago. Preston whipped around his face, turning a dark, violent shade of red that clashed horribly with his expensive designer tuxedo. The absolute audacity of the accusation hit Preston like a physical blow, causing his broad shoulders to tense with pure aggressive fury. "You worthless coward," Preston roared, taking a heavy, threatening step toward Darius with his fists completely clenched at his sides. "Do you want me to tell everyone in this room where your half of the stolen money really went? Do you want Sierra to know exactly what kind of sick, twisted, degenerate criminal secrets you constantly hide behind that fake, charming smile of yours?" Darius scrambled backward on the stage floor, his expensive dress shoes slipping awkwardly against the smooth wood as he tried to get away from Preston's looming physical threat. "Please," Darius begged, his voice cracking with absolute pathetic terror. "Do not do it, Preston. Please do not tell them. I had to do what you said. You forced my hand." But Preston was far beyond the point of mercy or reason. His entire commercial real estate empire was currently being seized by federal agents, and his carefully curated image of white male supremacy was burning to ash in front of the most powerful investors in Atlanta. If he was going down, he was absolutely going to drag everyone else down into the flames with him. He was not a man who took betrayal lightly, especially not from someone he viewed as his subordinate. Preston stormed across the stage, his heavy footsteps thudding through the microphone I was still holding. He roughly snatched the microphone from my hand. I let him take it without any resistance, simply taking a calm, graceful step backward to give him the space to execute his own spectacular public demise. Preston reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. His fingers were moving frantically, angrily tapping across the screen as he navigated to his saved audio files. He marched over to the sophisticated audio control panel situated at the edge of the podium. With brutal, aggressive force, he jammed his auxiliary cable directly into the hotel sound system, completely overriding the ambient background music that had started playing softly when the initial chaos broke out. "You want to play the victim, Darius Preston?" sneered his voice, echoing massively through the ballroom speakers. "You want to pretend I forced you to steal from your own wife? Let us hear exactly who was begging who for money. Let us hear the real reason you were so desperate to drain every single cent out of Lux Haven." Preston pressed a button on his phone, and the ballroom was instantly filled with a new sound. It was not a professional business conversation. It was a pathetic, desperate, weeping voice. It was Darius. The high-quality audio system broadcasted his absolute humiliation to every single corner of the St. Regis ballroom, allowing every politician, investor, and socialite to hear the exact tone of a man begging for his very life. The recording started with the sound of heavy, frantic breathing, followed by a loud, pathetic sob. "Preston, you have to help me," the recorded voice of Darius pleaded, sounding completely broken and terrified. "They are going to kill me, Preston. The sports betting syndicate is threatening to break my legs. I owe them over $2 million, and they are calling my office every single day. You have to advance me the cash from the real estate merger right now. Please, man, I am begging you." The wealthy guests in the ballroom gasped in collective horror. The polished, successful investment banker they all thought they knew was actually a degenerate gambling addict, deeply indebted to a violent underground sports betting syndicate. Darius covered his ears with his hands, curling into a tight, pathetic ball on the stage floor, wishing he could disappear into the wood. But the recording was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. On the audio, Preston could be heard laughing coldly. "Why should I bail you out, Darius? Your wife is the one with the successful company. Ask Jada for the money." The response from Darius was so dripping with venom and cruel manipulation that it made the air in the ballroom turn completely freezing cold. "I do not love Jada." The recorded voice of Darius screamed his words, echoing, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "I never loved her. She is just an emotional workaholic who thinks she is better than everyone else. I only married her because I needed her pristine credit score and her business assets to cover my previous debts. I cannot stand looking at her anymore. I just need her money. As soon as we drain Lux Haven completely dry, Sierra and I are taking the cash and running off to Europe. Sierra hates her just as much as I do. We are going to leave Jada with absolutely nothing." The entire ballroom fell into a state of absolute total shock. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was almost impossible to fully comprehend. A man had just admitted to a room full of elite society members that his entire 7-year marriage was nothing but a calculated financial scam designed to bleed his wife dry and run away with her own biological sister. Sierra, who had been standing frozen near the edge of the stage, suddenly let out a loud, piercing shriek that sounded like a wounded animal. The illusion she had built her entire life upon was shattering into a million sharp, jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. She looked at Darius, the man who had promised her a luxurious life in Europe, the man who had supposedly loved her enough to steal millions for her, and saw him for what he truly was. He was not a wealthy savior coming to rescue her from her boring marriage. He was a destitute, desperate gambling addict who was using her just as much as he was using me. She spun around to look at Preston, her husband, the man she thought possessed endless wealth and power. But she knew now from my earlier revelations that Preston was completely broke, his real estate empire, a house of cards built on stolen money and federal fraud. She was suddenly trapped between two men who had absolutely nothing left to offer her. No money, no status, no protection. The glamorous influencer lifestyle she had sacrificed her own sister to maintain was evaporating into thin air. The reality of her situation hit Sierra with the force of a speeding train. The wealthy women in the audience, the same socialites who had liked her photos and complimented her stolen diamond necklace, were now pointing their phones directly at her, recording every single second of her spectacular public humiliation. The flashing lights of smartphone cameras illuminated her tear-streaked face, capturing the exact moment the golden child of the Addams family finally fell from her imaginary pedestal. She stumbled forward, her silver-sequined gown catching awkwardly on her high heels. She dropped to her knees on the stage, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy, chaotic strands across her face. She looked out at the audience of judging, glaring eyes and tried to do the only thing she had ever known how to do. She tried to play the innocent, flawless victim. "I was manipulated!" Sierra cried loudly, forcing heavy theatrical tears to stream down her face. She reached her hands out toward the crowd, begging for their sympathy and understanding. "I did not know anything about the stolen money. Darius lied to me. Preston lied to me. They used me as a pawn in their corporate games. I am just a victim of their toxic greed. I never wanted to hurt my sister. I had no idea where the money was coming from. Please, you have to believe me, I am innocent." She sobbed loudly, burying her face in her hands, expecting anyone to step forward and comfort her. She expected our father Vernon to rush to her side and shield her from the consequences, just as he had done her entire life. But Vernon was still paralyzed on the floor, entirely consumed by his own impending federal prison sentence and the absolute destruction of his own fake legacy. No one came to Sierra's rescue. The room remained entirely unsympathetic, watching her performative grief with cold, detached disgust. I stood a few feet away, watching my sister desperately try to weave one final pathetic lie to save her own skin. I felt absolutely no sympathy for her. I felt no lingering sisterly bond tying me to her pain. I only felt the cool, sharp precision of a surgeon removing a cancerous tumor. I let a short, sharp laugh escape my lips. The sound was cold and completely devoid of any warmth, cutting through Sierra's fake sobbing like a razor blade. The sudden noise made her look up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and lingering arrogant entitlement. "You did not know?" I asked, my voice smooth and loud enough for every single recording smartphone in the room to capture clearly. "You expect these highly intelligent people to believe that you were just a helpless, naive little pawn in this massive federal fraud scheme. You want them to believe that the $50,000 diamond tennis necklace currently resting on your chest just magically appeared out of thin air without a single receipt." Sierra scrambled backward slightly, her hand flying up to cover the stolen diamonds. "Jada, please," she whispered, breaking character for a fraction of a second. "Do not do this to me. We are sisters." "We stopped being sisters the moment you decided my life was something you could casually dismantle for your own amusement," I replied, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You claim you knew nothing about the money. You claim Darius and Preston kept you entirely in the dark. Then perhaps you can explain to everyone in this room why the hidden security footage from my personal office shows you physically breaking into my wall safe in the dead of night." Sierra's face drained of all remaining color, turning a sickening shade of pale gray. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. She knew exactly what footage I was talking about. She knew I had caught her. I raised my hand and made a sharp, decisive motion toward the heavy double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom. The doors swung open with a loud, dramatic thud, pulling the attention of the entire crowd away from the stage for just a moment. My elite legal team, dressed in immaculate dark suits, marched into the room in a single file line. They were pushing two heavy-duty industrial metal carts. Stacked high upon these carts were dozens of sturdy cardboard banker's boxes. The boxes were clearly labeled with bright red federal evidence stickers. My legal team wheeled the carts straight down the center aisle, parting the sea of wealthy guests until they reached the very front of the stage. They parked the carts directly in front of where Sierra was kneeling on the floor, making sure she had a perfect, unobstructed view of the massive mountain of undeniable paper evidence. "You see, Sierra, I did not just secure the audio files. I continued, projecting my voice over the stunned, gasping crowd. When I suspected you and Darius were draining my accounts, I initiated a full comprehensive forensic audit of every single transaction made over the last 6 months. Those boxes sitting right in front of you contain hard certified copies of every single offshore wire transfer, every single fraudulent property deed, and every single shell company registration document used to launder my stolen money." I walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, looking down at my trembling, terrified sister. "And the most fascinating detail about all those documents, Sierra, is not the amount of money stolen. It is the signatures at the very bottom of the pages. Because Darius and Preston did not sign those offshore transfer authorizations. You did. Your signature is plastered across hundreds of pages of federal financial crimes authorizing the movement of stolen corporate funds into your personal influencer accounts. You were not a victim in the dark, Sierra. You were the lead signatory on a massive money laundering operation." The final absolute realization of her doom washed over Sierra's face. She looked at the towering stack of bankers' boxes containing the undeniable proof of her immense greed and criminal liability. She could not blame Darius. She could not hide behind Preston. She could not cry to our father. Her own arrogant handwriting had sealed her permanent fate. The crowd of elite society members pointed their cameras directly at her, documenting the exact moment the beautiful, untouchable golden child of Buckhead realized she was going to spend the best years of her life wearing a federal prison jumpsuit. The trap had snapped completely shut. There was absolutely no way out. The ultimate justice was finally entirely served tonight. The oppressive silence in the grand ballroom was abruptly shattered by the sound of Preston letting out a harsh breath of pure, unadulterated desperation. He looked around at the fleeing wealthy investors and the federal seizure warrant glowing ominously on the giant screens above. The reality of his total financial ruin was finally piercing through his thick skull. But Preston was a man who had never faced a single real consequence in his entire privileged life. He was a third-generation real estate developer, born with a silver spoon securely wedged in his arrogant mouth. Whenever he made a mistake, he simply expected the world to bend and accommodate him. He believed his skin color and his family wealth formed an invisible, impenetrable shield against the laws that governed ordinary people. I watched as his initial terror slowly morphed back into that familiar toxic arrogance. He straightened his ruined posture and reached into the inside pocket of his expensive tailored tuxedo jacket. His hands were still shaking slightly, but a cruel, desperate smirk began to creep back onto his pale face. He pulled out his phone, gripping it like a weapon that could magically erase the federal crimes he had committed. "You really think you can corner me, Jada?" He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension as he stared down at me from the stage. "You think some clever little paperwork trick is going to put me behind bars? You clearly do not understand how this city actually works. My father is a state senator. My family practically built the infrastructure of Atlanta. One phone call to my dad, and this entire federal warrant disappears before midnight. The judges play golf with my uncle. The police chief attends our holiday parties. You are completely out of your depth, sweetheart." I stood at the base of the stage stairs, looking up at this pathetic excuse for a man. He was literally staring at a federal indictment, and he still believed his daddy could just buy his way out of a federal crime. He began furiously tapping on his phone screen, dialing his father's private number. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to prove that my meticulous strategic brilliance was absolutely nothing compared to his inherited systemic power. He pressed the speakerphone button, making sure the volume was turned all the way up so that I could hear his powerful father swoop in to save the day and put me back in my place. I did not flinch. I did not back down. I slowly walked down the short set of stage steps, my gold stilettos clicking softly against the marble floor, until I was standing right at the base of the platform, confronting Preston directly eye to eye. He looked down at me, expecting to see fear or hesitation. Instead, he saw the cold, hard, absolute certainty of a woman who had already won the war. "You always thought you were entirely untouchable, Preston," I said, my voice calm and steady, carrying clearly through the mostly empty ballroom. "You walked through life treating everyone around you like disposable assets. You treated my family like an entertaining side project. You looked at me and you saw an emotional black woman from Buckhead who was beneath your intellectual level. You thought a black woman could never possibly outsmart a prestigious third-generation developer like yourself. You sat in my father's office and you called my multi-million-dollar company a cute little urban hustle." Preston held his phone out, waiting for the call to connect, his smirk faltering slightly under my unwavering gaze. "You thought you could steal my life and hand me a pathetic 5% allowance like I was a child?" I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to him. "But the problem with arrogance, Preston, is that it makes you incredibly, extremely lazy. You never bothered to look beneath the surface. You never bothered to check who was actually buying up the debt on your failing commercial properties over the last 8 months." Preston's face suddenly dropped. The color drained from his cheeks rapidly, turning his skin a sickly, translucent shade of chalky gray. His eyes darted nervously between me and the phone still ringing loudly on speaker. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice losing all its previous manufactured confidence. "What do you know about my commercial properties?" I offered him a chilling, perfectly composed smile. "I know that your real estate empire has been bankrupt for a very long time," I replied smoothly. "I know that you have been defaulting on your commercial loans and dodging your creditors for the better part of a year. And I know this because through an anonymous proxy firm, I have been quietly and systematically buying up every single piece of your distressed debt." I watched his entire reality shatter into a million irreparable pieces. His jaw slacked, and his hands began to tremble violently again. "You see, Preston, I do not just own Lux Haven," I announced, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom with the crushing weight of absolute authority. "I own the promissory notes on all of your downtown office buildings. I own the deed to your massive luxury mansion. I even own the primary mortgage on this very country club where you decided to host this pathetic excuse for a gala tonight. You are completely, entirely, and hopelessly indebted to me. I am your sole primary creditor. I own your entire life." Preston's legs practically gave out from beneath him. He stumbled back against the wooden podium, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. He was staring at a woman who had just single-handedly dismantled his entire inherited empire and purchased his future for pennies on the dollar. All of his white privilege, all of his family connections, and all of his arrogant assumptions had led him directly into the jaws of my perfectly executed trap. The loud, persistent ringing of his phone suddenly stopped. A sharp click echoed through the ballroom speakers, followed by the sound of heavy, panicked breathing. Preston immediately lunged toward the device, his eyes wide with a sudden, desperate spark of hope. "Dad," he cried out, his voice cracking with sheer pathetic terror. "Dad, you have to help me right now. It is Jada. She set me up. She transferred the assets and now the IRS is here and they are freezing my accounts. You have to call the judges, Dad. You have to fix this mess before they arrest me." He held the phone out, expecting the deep, booming, supportive voice of his wealthy state senator father to calm him down and promise him immediate legal protection. He expected his father to use his vast political power to crush me and erase the federal warrant glowing on the screen above them. Instead, the voice that came through the speaker was frantic, breathless, and completely devoid of any authority. "Preston, you complete, utter, absolute idiot!" His father's voice screamed through the phone, the sound distorted by panic and overwhelming despair. "What the hell have you done? The feds just raided my private political office downtown." Preston's face went completely blank. "Dad, what are you talking about?" he whispered, the phone trembling wildly in his hand. "The federal agents just kicked down my doors." His father roared, the sound of chaos and shouting clearly audible in the background of the call. "Your fraudulent commercial loans were directly tied to my political action committee accounts. You used my signature to guarantee your fake acquisitions, you worthless fool. They are seizing all my political campaign funds. They are taking my computers. My entire career is completely destroyed because of your monumental stupidity." Preston stared at the phone as if it had turned into a venomous snake. He could not comprehend the words his powerful, untouchable father was saying. "But Dad, you have to call your lawyers," Preston begged, tears finally welling up in his cold blue eyes. "You have to protect me. I do not have any lawyers left." "Preston," his father screamed back, his voice breaking with absolute devastation. "They are freezing everything. You brought federal wire fraud charges to my doorstep. You are completely, utterly, and entirely on your own. Do not ever call this number again." A sharp click echoed through the ballroom as the line went completely dead. The dial tone buzzed loudly through the sound system, serving as the final definitive soundtrack to Preston's total destruction. He stood there on the stage, a broken, destitute man with absolutely nothing left to his name. His wealth was gone. His political protection was gone. His arrogant pride was completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a cowardly, terrified criminal waiting to be hauled away in handcuffs. I looked at him standing there, paralyzed by the magnitude of his own catastrophic failure, and I felt a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my entire soul. Every single insult he had hurled at me, every single time he had belittled my business, every single microaggression he had used to make me feel small, had been repaid 1,000 times over. The man who had looked down his nose at me and called my life a cute urban hustle was now entirely at my mercy. And I had absolutely zero mercy left to give. Darius was still sobbing on the floor, his expensive suit ruined, his future completely obliterated. Sierra was kneeling on the stage, staring blankly at the dead phone in Preston's hand, finally realizing that there was no knight in shining armor coming to save her from the consequences of her terrible toxic choices. Vernon, my father, was still weeping uncontrollably near the edge of the platform, grieving the complete loss of the prestigious reputation he loved more than his own daughter. The four of them were trapped together on a sinking ship they had built with their own greedy hands. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air of the empty ballroom fill my lungs. The heavy, oppressive weight of their expectations and their constant psychological abuse was finally lifted from my shoulders. I had carried their toxicity for 32 years, constantly trying to prove my worth to a family that was fundamentally incapable of seeing it. But standing here tonight, watching the absolute ruin of the people who had shoved me into a dark cedar closet and tried to steal my life, I realized I never needed their validation at all. My worth was not determined by their approval. My success was not dependent on their permission. I had built an empire with my own two hands, and I had fiercely protected it with my own brilliant mind. Preston slowly lowered his phone, his arm dropping limply to his side. He looked at me with hollow, empty eyes, stripped of all his unearned confidence. He had nothing left to say. There were no more threats to make no more racist comments, to hurl no more powerful politicians to call for a rescue. He was just a common criminal standing under the glaring red light of a federal warrant waiting for the police to arrive. The mass exodus from the St. Regis Ballroom was a spectacular sight to behold. The wealthiest and most influential people in Atlanta, the very same individuals who had clapped for my supposed mental breakdown just 20 minutes earlier, were now fleeing the room as if the crystal chandeliers were rigged with explosives. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal financial crime. I watched them shove past each other, their expensive silk gowns and custom-tailored tuxedos wrinkling in their desperate, frantic rush toward the heavy double doors. Spilled champagne seeped into the luxurious carpets. Abandoned hors d'oeuvres were trampled under panicked designer shoes. Within minutes, the massive glittering venue was entirely empty of guests. The only people left remaining in the sprawling, silent room were the five of us, my personal elite security team, and my corporate lawyers, who stood quietly in the shadows, like silent sentinels guarding a fortress. The silence that followed the stampede was thick and heavy, settling over the remaining occupants like a suffocating wool blanket. I stood near the center aisle, feeling the cool air conditioning brush against the silk of my emerald green suit. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp metallic scent of absolute victory. Preston was still standing near the podium, his phone hanging limply from his hand, his eyes wide and vacant. His powerful state senator father had abandoned him to the wolves, and his entire white privilege armor had dissolved into thin air. Sierra was still on her knees, surrounded by the banker boxes full of her own criminal signatures, her chest heaving as she finally comprehended the total evaporation of her glamorous influencer lifestyle. Darius remained crumpled on the stage floor, a pathetic broken mess of a man who had gambled away his marriage, his career, and his freedom for absolutely nothing. And then there was my father. Vernon had always prided himself on his impeccable posture, his unshakable stoicism, and his commanding presence. He was a man who demanded respect and obedience from everyone who crossed his path, especially his daughters. But the man who was currently crawling across the stage floor toward me was completely unrecognizable. He looked like a terrified, fragile shell of a human being. The federal seizure warrant, glaring brightly on the screens above, had effectively stripped him of his dignity, his power, and his carefully curated Buckhead society image. He knew that his secret offshore gambling debts and his illegal manipulation of my mother's life insurance policy were now fully exposed to the harsh light of reality. He knew he was looking at spending the remaining years of his life rotting inside a federal penitentiary. Vernon scrambled down the short set of carpeted stairs, his knees hitting the marble floor with a heavy thud. He crawled directly toward my feet, his expensive suit trousers dragging against the polished stone. Tears were streaming freely down his wrinkled face, mixing with the heavy sweat pouring from his forehead. He reached out with trembling, desperate hands and grabbed the hem of my emerald green blazer, clutching the silk fabric as if it were a life raft in the middle of a raging ocean. "Jada, please!" he sobbed loudly, his voice cracking and echoing pathetically through the empty ballroom. "Jada, I am begging you, please look at me. I am your father. I am your own flesh and blood. You cannot let them take me away to federal prison, Jada. I will die in there. I will not survive a single month behind bars. You are the only one who can stop this. You own the debt now. You can buy the specific loans that tie me to Preston's fraud. You have the money, Jada. You have millions. Please save me." He wept hysterically, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes. It was a truly pathetic sight. The great patriarch of the Addams family, the man who had shoved his own daughter into a dark cedar closet and threatened to lock her in a psychiatric ward just a month ago, was now groveling at my stiletto heels. He was begging for mercy from the exact same woman he had systematically abused, belittled, and stolen from for 32 long, agonizing years. I looked down at the top of his graying head, feeling an overwhelming sense of emotional detachment. I did not feel a single shred of pity for his tears. I did not feel the familiar tug of filial obligation that he had weaponized against me my entire life. I felt nothing but cold, analytical precision. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his sweaty, trembling fingers off the delicate silk fabric of my blazer. I took a deliberate step backward, putting a clear physical boundary between my hard-earned success and his miserable, self-inflicted ruin. "You gave me life, Vernon," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of any warmth or compassion. "But you never gave me a family. You gave me a business arrangement where my only value was what you could steal from me to fund your own toxic addictions and support your golden child. You used my existence as a shield for your own failures. You watched my husband betray me, and you helped him do it just to clear your own gambling debts. You are not my father. You are just a criminal who finally ran out of places to hide." Vernon let out a wretched wailing sound, pressing his face against the cold marble floor. "Please, Jada," he begged again, his voice muffled by the stone. "I will do anything. I will apologize every single day for the rest of my life. Just do not let the feds take me." I stared down at his pathetic, trembling form and snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound echoed through the vast, empty space. Immediately, my lead corporate attorney stepped out from the shadows near the entrance doors. She walked briskly across the ballroom, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, carrying a sleek black leather folder. She stopped right beside me and handed me a single crisp white document printed on heavy legal paper. I took the document and looked back down at Vernon. "I will pay off the specific loan that keeps you out of a federal penitentiary," I said softly, my words slicing through his loud sobbing like a surgical scalpel. "I will clear the immediate debt that ties your political action committee accounts to Preston's federal wire fraud. I will make sure that the feds do not drag you out of your house in handcuffs tonight." Vernon snapped his head up, a sudden desperate glimmer of hope lighting up his tear-streaked eyes. "Thank you, Jada," he gasped, trying to reach for my hand again. "Thank you. I knew you had a good heart. I knew you would not abandon your family." I pulled my hand away before he could touch me. "I am not doing this out of the goodness of my heart, Vernon," I corrected him, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I am doing this because I want to be the one who strips you of absolutely everything you hold dear. I am offering you a trade. Your freedom from federal prison in exchange for your entire remaining existence." I held the crisp white document out, letting it hover just inches from his desperate, grasping hands. "This is an irrevocable transfer of assets," I explained, detailing the terms of his total destruction with absolute corporate precision. "In exchange for paying off your immediate legal liabilities, you are going to sign over every single last remaining asset you possess. You are giving me the title to your Buckhead mansion. You are signing over the deeds to your luxury vehicles. You are completely liquidating your entire remaining political pension fund and transferring every single cent to me. You will literally not own the shoes on your feet when you walk out of this hotel tonight." Vernon stared at the legal document, his eyes wide with renewed horror. "But Jada, where will I live?" he whimpered, his voice trembling. "How will I survive if you take my pension and my home? I will be completely destitute. I will have nothing left." "That is exactly the point, Vernon," I said, offering him a chilling, unforgiving smile. "You took the life insurance money my deceased mother left to protect me, and you gambled it away. You tried to take my multi-million-dollar business and leave me locked in a mental institution. So now I am taking your house, your cars, and your retirement. And the best part is that I am not even keeping a single dime of it for myself." I turned slightly to make sure Sierra, who was still kneeling by the stage, could hear every single word I was saying. "Every single asset I strip from you today is going directly into a new charity foundation I just established." I announced, my voice ringing with triumphant authority. "It is a foundation dedicated specifically to funding and uplifting minority women entrepreneurs in Atlanta. The very same women you and Preston mocked and belittled." Your entire legacy, Vernon, the wealth you prized above your own daughter, is going to fund the dreams of women exactly like me. You and Sierra will walk out of here tonight with exactly what you tried to give me. Absolutely nothing. Sierra let out a loud, agonizing scream from the stage. Dad, you cannot sign that, she shrieked, stumbling to her feet, her silver dress covered in dust from the floor. If you give her the house and the pension, where am I supposed to go? Preston is completely broke. My influencer accounts are going to be seized by the feds. I do not have any money, Jada. You cannot leave me out on the street. I am your sister. I looked at Sierra with a mixture of absolute pity and profound disgust. You should have thought about your living arrangements before you decided to sleep with my husband and forge my signature on offshore wire transfers. Sierra, I replied coldly. You spent your entire life believing you were a queen simply because Dad bought you a shiny crown with my stolen money. Well, the royal treasury is officially empty now. You are going to have to learn how to survive in the real world, just like the rest of us. Maybe you can use your pageant skills to secure a minimum wage retail job. Sierra burst into fresh, hysterical tears, realizing that her glamorous, untouchable life was permanently over. She looked to Preston for help, but her husband was still leaning against the podium, completely paralyzed by his own impending doom, staring blankly into space. He had no money to save her and no power to protect her. She was entirely on her own. Vernon looked back and forth between his weeping golden child and the cold, hard legal document hovering in front of his face. He knew he had absolutely no other options left. It was either sign away his entire material life and face public humiliation, or refuse to sign and spend the next 20 years locked in a tiny federal prison cell. He was a coward at his core, a man who valued his own physical comfort and safety above all else. He reached up with a shaking, sweaty hand and took the document from my fingers. He pulled a gold pen from his jacket pocket. The exact same pen he had tried to use to sign my involuntary psychiatric hold just a month ago. His hand was trembling so violently that he could barely hold the instrument steady. He pressed the pen to the paper and slowly, painfully signed away his mansion, his luxury cars, his lucrative political pension, and his entire carefully guarded legacy. A loud, wretched sob escaped his throat as he completed the final signature, effectively erasing himself from the Atlanta elite society forever. I took the signed document from his hands, checking the signature to ensure it was legally binding. I nodded to my corporate attorney, handing her the paper. File this immediately, I instructed. Make sure the transfer is complete before the banks open tomorrow morning. My lawyer smiled a sharp, predatory grin and tucked the document safely into her leather folder, stepping back into the shadows. Vernon remained on the floor, weeping into his hands, a completely broken and defeated old man. Sierra had collapsed back onto the stage, hugging her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth as she mourned the death of her unearned luxury. Preston was still frozen in shock, unable to process the absolute destruction of his white privilege and his real estate empire. But out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. Darius, my treacherous, deceitful husband, had been incredibly quiet for the last 10 minutes. While Vernon was begging for his life and Sierra was screaming about her housing situation, Darius had been slowly, quietly inching his way across the stage floor. He was using the distraction of my father's breakdown to slowly crawl toward the heavy velvet curtains that masked the backstage service doors. He knew that the federal wire fraud charges hanging over his head were inescapable. He knew that Preston had thrown him under the bus and played his recorded confession for the entire room. He knew that the evidence boxes sitting on the stage contained enough proof to lock him away for a very long time. He was trying to make a desperate, pathetic run for it. I stood perfectly still, watching him move like a coward in the shadows. I did not shout. I did not alert my security team. I simply watched him slowly push himself up off the floor, his ruined suit hanging loosely on his frame. He glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes darting frantically around the room to see if anyone had noticed his escape attempt. When he saw that my focus was seemingly on my father, he let out a silent breath of relief and lunged for the brass handle of the heavy wooden service door. He grabbed the cold metal, pulling the door open just a few inches, ready to sprint down the back hallways of the St. Regis Hotel and disappear into the humid Atlanta night. He thought he had found a tiny loophole in my master plan. But Darius was always a fool who thought he was a genius. As he pulled the heavy service door open, hoping to find a dark, empty hallway, offering him a quick path to freedom. Two tall, broad-shouldered men, wearing dark tactical windbreakers, stepped out of the shadows. They moved with swift, terrifying precision, completely blocking his only route of escape. The bright overhead lights of the backstage corridor caught the reflection of the solid gold badges hanging heavily around their necks. Darius froze his hand, still clutching the brass door handle, his eyes widening in absolute sheer terror as he realized his nightmare was only just beginning. "Darius Vance, one of the men?" asked his voice. A deep, booming baritone that echoed through the silent ballroom, commanding absolute total authority. Darius could not even muster the strength to speak. He just stood there, trembling, staring at the gold shields that represented the end of his entire miserable existence. "FBI Financial Crimes Division," the second man announced, stepping forward and swiftly grabbing Darius by the shoulder, spinning him around with brutal professional force. "Keep your hands exactly where we can see them." The sudden, violent physical motion sent a massive shockwave of absolute panic through the remaining occupants of the empty ballroom. The federal agent did not offer Darius a single moment to process his rapidly crumbling reality. With a swift, highly aggressive movement, the massive agent forcefully slammed Darius against the heavy wooden paneling of the service door. The loud, sickening thud of his body hitting the wall echoed across the quiet marble floor. Darius let out a pathetic, whimpering gasp as his arms were roughly wrenched behind his back by the professionals. The distinct metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists sealed his inevitable permanent fate in an instant. His expensive, custom-tailored designer suit jacket tore visibly at the shoulder seam, serving as a physical manifestation of his completely ruined high society image. He was no longer a charismatic, highly successful investment banker commanding respect in Atlanta. He was just a desperate, cornered criminal facing decades of isolation inside a federal penitentiary. Darius frantically twisted his neck, straining painfully to look back over his shoulder. His terrified, tear-filled eyes desperately searched the massive room until they finally locked directly onto my face with pathetic, desperate eyes. I was standing near the edge of the stage, watching his physical and social destruction with absolute icy detachment. The charming, handsome mask he had used to actively deceive me for 7 long, agonizing years was entirely gone, leaving behind nothing but raw, unfiltered cowardice and pathetic fear. "Jada, please!" he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer, pathetic desperation as the two federal agents began to pull him violently away from the wooden door. "We were building a life together, Jada. I loved you. I swear to God, I really loved you so much. Please just tell them it was all a big, massive misunderstanding. Tell them Preston made me do it to save his company. You cannot let them take me away to prison like this." I did not flinch or react to his pathetic weeping cries. His salty tears meant absolutely nothing to me right now. They were just cheap, transparent manipulations from a weak man who had finally exhausted all of his deceptive, abusive tactics. I slowly walked across the vast ballroom floor, my gold stiletto heels measuring out the final remaining seconds of his temporary freedom. I stopped just a few feet away from where the heavy federal agents were holding him securely against the wall. I reached deep into the sleek pocket of my emerald green blazer and slowly pulled out a small silver flash drive. The smooth metal caught the dim, ambient light of the crystal chandeliers, glinting like a tiny, perfect, lethal weapon. I held the small digital device out, extending my steady hand toward the lead FBI agent. "This contains the raw, unedited audio recording from my father's dark cedar closet," I said, my voice smooth and totally devoid of any emotional warmth or lingering sympathy. "It also contains the forged medical documents they illegally intended to use against me, along with every single certified wire transfer receipt, permanently linking him to the offshore money laundering accounts. Have a nice life, Darius." The tall federal agent nodded respectfully, taking the silver flash drive directly from my hand and securing it safely inside a plastic evidence bag. Darius stared at the small, clear bag, his eyes widening with absolute, complete, horrifying realization. He knew that tiny silver drive contained the undeniable, irrefutable proof that would keep him locked inside a concrete cell for the rest of his natural adult life. All of his lies, all of his theft, and all of his betrayal were permanently digitized and handed directly over to the federal government. I looked Darius dead in his panicked eyes, offering him one last perfectly composed, chilling smile. I turned my back on him completely, severing the last invisible tie that bound my bright future to his pathetic, miserable existence. "No, Jada, please do not do this to me," he wailed loudly, thrashing wildly against the firm, unyielding grip of the federal agents. "You cannot just leave me here to rot. Jada, please look at me." His desperate, agonizing screams echoed loudly through the grand hallway as the two agents dragged him completely out of the ballroom and into the dark, humid Atlanta night. The heavy wooden service doors swung shut behind them, abruptly cutting off his frantic begging and plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. My treacherous, manipulative husband was finally permanently gone from my life. The sound of Darius being dragged away to prison seemed to completely break whatever fragile threads of sanity Sierra was still desperately clinging to. Sierra completely loses her mind in front of everyone. The harsh reality of her total absolute isolation crashed down upon her narrow shoulders, causing her to completely lose her mind. She was entirely stripped of her secret lover. She was entirely stripped of her white husband's arrogant wealth and political protection. And she was entirely stripped of the protective financial shield her father had always illegally provided for her. She was completely alone, facing the devastating consequences of her own immense toxic greed. Sierra scrambled up from the dirty stage floor, her ruined silver-sequined gown tearing loudly as her stiletto heel caught the delicate, expensive fabric. Her perfectly styled dark hair was now a chaotic, tangled mess, framing her tear-stained, blotchy face. She looked down at me from the elevated stage, her eyes burning with a wild, rabid, hysterical hatred that bordered on absolute madness. She screams at me, blaming me for absolutely everything that had gone wrong in her miserable, shallow existence. "You ruined my entire life," she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and grating horribly against the elegant acoustic walls of the hotel ballroom. "You destroyed absolutely everything, Jada. I was a queen in this city. I had the massive mansion and the endless money and the loyal followers. Everybody loved me. I was always the beautiful one. You were supposed to be the ugly, invisible one. You were supposed to stay quietly in the background and let me shine forever. How dare you take my perfect life away from me today?" She stomped her foot on the wooden stage like a petulant, spoiled toddler throwing a massive tantrum because someone had finally taken away her stolen toys. Her absolute profound delusion was almost fascinating to quietly witness. Even now, as she stood completely surrounded by heavy banker boxes filled with undeniable certified evidence of her own federal financial crimes, she still truly, honestly believed that she was the ultimate innocent victim of the universe. She still believed that her physical beauty entitled her to steal my company and actively destroy my mental health without facing any legal repercussions. "You were supposed to be nothing," she sobbed violently, aggressively, wiping the heavy, ruined makeup from her cheeks with the back of her trembling, manicured hand. "Dad always said you were absolutely nothing. You just got extremely lucky with your business. You just stole my happiness because you have always been so deeply, violently jealous of me and my perfect life." I stood calmly at the base of the stage, looking up at my older sister with pure, unfiltered pity. I did not feel angry or bitter anymore. The burning, raging, fiery fury that had fueled my meticulous, strategic revenge over the last 6 long months had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but pure, unfiltered, deeply profound pity. She was a hollow, empty, shallow shell of a human being who had spent her entire existence feeding off the positive energy and hard-earned resources of the people around her. I looked at her tangled, messy hair, her ruined, expensive designer dress, and the stolen $50,000 diamond tennis necklace, still resting heavily against her sweaty chest. She looked incredibly, extremely, remarkably pathetic standing there alone. "You are only ever valued for your reflection, Sierra," I said, my voice calm and exceptionally steady, carrying the absolute, undeniable heavy weight of the harsh truth. You spent your entire life polishing the outside of the glass, desperate to make sure everyone saw you as a flawless, beautiful, untouchable pageant queen. You eagerly let Dad use your pretty face to mask his own miserable failures, and you happily used your wealthy husband's money to buy the fake affection you could never ever earn on your own individual merit. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the dark reality of her total impending destruction settle over her trembling, shivering frame. But the ultimate problem with living your entire life, as a mere reflection, is that glass is incredibly fragile. I continued, my tone soft but piercingly sharp and lethal. And now that the mirror is permanently, violently shattered, you have absolutely nothing left inside your soul. You are completely, utterly, totally empty, Sierra. And that is exactly why you will never ever survive the harsh real world waiting for you outside these doors. Sierra let out a quiet, wounded, pathetic whimper, slowly sinking back down onto the hard stage floor, hiding her ruined face in her shaking hands, as the terrible, undeniable truth of my words finally broke her completely. She had absolutely nothing left to fight with. Her long reign of toxic terror was officially, permanently over. Vernon collapsed forward, completely pressing his sweaty forehead against the cold, hard marble floor, weeping loudly into the empty, silent, dark space. I slowly walked over to my attorney, my gold stilettos clicking rhythmically against the floor with purposeful power. I reached out and took the signed binding document directly from her hands. I looked down at the paper, feeling the immense, deeply satisfying weight of absolute, total, hard-earned victory coursing through my veins. I did not say another single word to my disgraced father. I did not look back at Sierra sobbing helplessly on the wooden stage. I did not spare a single passing thought for Preston paralyzed in silent shock, or Darius currently riding in the cramped back seat of a federal squad car. I simply clutched the precious document tightly, securely in my hand, turned gracefully on my heel, and walked proudly toward the grand exit of the St. Regis ballroom, leaving my toxic, broken family to burn forever in the dark, miserable ashes of their own glorious, spectacular ruin without another word. 6 months passed since that unforgettable night at the St. Regis. The bitter winter of my betrayal had finally thawed, giving way to a vibrant Atlanta spring. The heavy, suffocating shadows of my toxic family were completely gone, replaced by sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my building. It was a Tuesday morning, and the air was buzzing with an electric, undeniable energy. I stood proudly on the wide marble steps of the newly constructed national headquarters for Lux Haven. The building was an architectural masterpiece of glass and steel. A monument to my absolute triumph, I held a pair of oversized golden scissors in my hands, surrounded by the people who had actually proven their loyalty. My brilliant corporate stood to my right, smiling warmly. My dedicated staging crew, the people who had worked 80-hour weeks alongside me, cheered loudly from the crowd. There were no fake smiles here today. There were no manipulative relatives hovering in the background waiting to steal my spotlight or diminish my achievements. The atmosphere was purely joyous, a celebration of authentic, hard-earned success. I squeezed the golden handles, and the thick green silk ribbon fell gracefully to the ground, marking the official beginning of my new empire. The crowd erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause. I walked through the towering glass doors, entering the modern lobby of my corporate fortress. The walls were decorated with stunning, high-resolution photographs of our most prestigious luxury staging projects. Mounted seamlessly into the stone wall behind the reception desk was a massive flat-screen television. The morning local news was currently playing, broadcasting the final conclusion to the dark chapter of my life. I paused in the center of the lobby, letting the soft voices of my colleagues fade into the background as I watched the news anchor detail the spectacular permanent downfall of the men who had tried to destroy me. The banner across the bottom of the screen read, "Federal Judge Delivers Maximum Sentences in Buckhead Real Estate Fraud Case." The screen shifted to show Preston and Darius being escorted out of the federal courthouse in heavy iron shackles and bright orange prison jumpsuits. Preston looked incredibly old and pathetic, his arrogant posture replaced by a defeated slump. His state senator father had cut ties with him, leaving him to face the justice system entirely alone. Darius walked behind him, keeping his head bowed in absolute shame. The news anchor reported that both men had officially received 10-year sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. Their stolen money was gone. Their elite status was permanently erased. They were going to spend the next decade locked inside a tiny concrete box, thinking about the woman they tried to lock inside a psychiatric ward. The broadcast briefly flashed a few updated photos of the other co-conspirators, providing a deeply satisfying glimpse into the miserable consequences of their toxic greed. Sierra was shown in a blurry photograph taken by a gossip blogger. She was no longer wearing expensive designer gowns or stolen custom diamond necklaces. She was wearing a stiff polyester uniform, working the cash register at a minimum wage retail store in a shopping mall. Her face looked chronically exhausted, her eyes hollow and stripped of all her former glamour. She was finally experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working-class world. She had spent her entire life mocking. And then there was Vernon. My father had been exiled from the affluent Buckhead society he prized above his own flesh and blood. The news segment mentioned that he was currently living in a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. Living entirely off a meager basic government stipend, he had absolutely nothing left. No mansion, no luxury cars, and no legacy. I smiled softly, turning away from the television screen and walking toward the private elevator that led to my executive suite. The doors opened seamlessly, and I rode to the top floor, stepping into a stunning corner office that overlooked the entire city of Atlanta. Waiting for me, sitting patiently on a plush velvet sofa, was a top investigative journalist from Forbes magazine. She was here to conduct an exclusive interview about my unprecedented rise in the luxury real estate market and corporate takeover. The reporter stood up, shaking my hand with deep professional respect before turning on her audio recorder. "Jada, you faced unimaginable betrayal from the people closest to you." The journalist began, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. "You were surrounded by people actively plotting your downfall. How did you manage to build such an incredible, massive empire when everyone in your own family was trying so desperately to bury you?" I walked slowly over to the expansive glass window, looking out over the magnificent Atlanta skyline. The towering skyscrapers and city streets stretched out for miles, forming a concrete kingdom that I now virtually owned and controlled. I felt completely powerful, totally poised, and entirely at peace with the universe. I turned back to face the camera and the journalist, letting a calm, radiant smile spread across my face. "Sometimes the people trying to bury you do not realize you are a seed," I said, my voice smooth, confident, and completely victorious. "They gave me the dirt, and I just used it to bloom." The journalist smiled. My core executive team entered carrying a tray of champagne and crystal flutes. We gathered around the center of the sunlit room, passing the glasses around to celebrate our massive, undisputed success. I raised my glass high in the air, looking at the loyal, wonderful people who had helped me protect my dream. We clinked our glasses together, the ringing sound echoing perfectly through the pristine, flawless office. Justice was not just served in the end, it was completely and masterfully executed. The heavy darkness was gone, and my beautiful, bright future was finally entirely my own. The most profound lesson we can learn from these heartbreaking experiences is that your biological family does not determine your ultimate worth or your future success. True family is defined by genuine respect and consistent support rather than mere bloodlines or toxic obligations. When the people who are supposed to protect you choose to betray you instead, you must find the absolute courage to walk away. Your greatest revenge will always be your own beautiful, independent success. Please share your own story of overcoming family betrayal in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more empowering daily videos.